Hello, I'm going to read part of 1 Peter. I read 1 Peter because this book seems to me to be a good one for Christians who are about to face difficult times to read. And I want to take simply the first 2 verses now. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles in the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, in sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ, and for sprinkling with his blood. May grace and peace be multiplied to you. Peter must have been writing these words around about 62 AD. He can see the world in which he and the Christians that he is caring for is becoming a more difficult place, and he wants to write to them urgently. And it's as well that he did, because somewhere between 64 and 66 AD, Peter and Paul will be dead. They will have been put to death by the Emperor Nero. So this is a particularly serious, urgent part of the Bible, telling Christians how to live in difficult times. And I've got 4 things that I'd like to share with you about that. First of all, I want to draw attention to the fact that Peter makes a great point of telling them that they are Christians because God has chosen them. Notice they are called elect according to the foreknowledge of God the Father. He's saying you became a Christian because God chose you to be a Christian. And though this does not minimize the fact that they chose to follow the Lord Jesus, it nonetheless is true that they chose to follow the Lord Jesus because God the Father had graciously chosen them to be his beforehand. That's great comfort for Christians who are under trial, because they know that their salvation doesn't depend just on their choice of Jesus, but on God's mighty grasp of them. And when we go through difficulties, even personal difficulties, it's important for us to grasp that our salvation comes from God, and even though our grasp of him may be frail, his grasp of us will always be strong, and none can take us from his hand. The second thing that this talks about is in sanctification of the Spirit. A person could ask, but how do I know, other than God's promise in the Bible, that I have been chosen by God? The way in which the New Testament frequently answers this question is to say the people chosen by God who have turned to the Lord Jesus are going to be people who are being changed into the likeness of Jesus, so that they now do things they never did before, and they've given up doing things that they did all the time before. And our sanctification, the change of our lives, is the evidence that God has chosen us to be his people. The change may not be as great. Indeed, it is never going to be as great as we would like, short of Jesus' return. But though that is true, every Christian person should be able to look into his own heart and at his life and see that since he became a Christian, God has been at work changing him so that he's got new desires and new passions and new horizons. So we base our confidence on the fact that God has chosen us, that he is at work with us, within us by his Spirit. And the third thing that Peter mentions is that we are those who have been chosen for obedience to Jesus Christ, for sprinkling with his blood. You might find that strange. Sprinkling with his blood sounds mystical, but this is what Peter is doing. Peter is saying, just as the people of Israel became the people of God when Moses offered covenant sacrifice and the people of Israel said, all that the Lord had said will we do and be obedient. Moses then sprinkled the blood of the sacrifice on the whole congregation there gathered, and from that moment they became the people of God, bound to him for obedience. You and I, through the Lord Jesus, have entered into the great relationship of being the very people of God. We may think of ourselves as utterly insignificant. We may think of ourselves as not important, as not the movers and shakers of the world that we know. But God sees us as his very own people. So it is our salvation, which comes from God. It is the change which is taking place within us, the change of sanctification to make us like Christ. It is the certainty of belonging to God through Jesus' death and therefore being bound to obedience to him that characterize us as Christians. All of those ideas come from the Old Testament. They're ideas that come from the Old Testament because Peter is bold to show that fairly insignificant Gentile people and ordinary people like you and I actually belong to that mighty company that God has chosen for himself. And there's one other thing. At the very beginning, Peter called them not only chosen by God, but exiles. That's the word that Abraham used of himself when he was traveling through the land of Canaan in Genesis chapter 23. And it means, in New Testament times, a person who's got no legal rights and no fixed place. And that is our relationship to the world around us. We are passing through this world. The home that God has chosen for us, with him forever, is in heaven. It is not part of this world. So that our relationship to this world is that of people who are passing through, sometimes Christians, and sometimes whole Christian denominations seem to be very much landed in this world. It seems to be me that the teaching of Peter here is that we do not have that relationship to this world. And so things which happen to us because we are Christians are not of absolute importance. The important thing is not how our non-Christian friends regard us. The important thing is how God regards us. These are pointers for pilgrims who are on a journey. They were true for people who lived in Pontus, Asia, Cappadocia, and Bithynia in the 1st century, but they are equally true for people who belong to St. John's Wishart in the 21st. God grant that you and I may grow in these things. Thank you very much for sharing with me.